So let's start with that JVM, man. Why that?
Well, that amp, it is my favorite amp to play through, recording on stage, especially on stage. And let me tell you, the requirement that I have is quite unique, right? I have 3 decades of published instrumental rock guitar songs, and the recordings vary from so many different studios, so many different amp setups, pedals, guitars. But when you're on stage and you go in song, you're up there for 2.5, 3 hours. You need to get an amp that can cover a lot of ground and also can really sing. This is one of the things about my gig that's so weird is that I have to play melodies and solos back to back all night long. Yeah. And I'm like a lead vocalist, except, the human voice is pretty pleasing. The guitar can get pretty crazy. Right. It's known for being the thing that gives you the attitude in rock. But here I am playing the melody, sometimes really high up the neck. So the struggle with my old gear was always like, that sounds good and angry for the chords, but I can't be screaming like that in people's ears all night long, playing these long melodies. It's not really a melody setup. Maybe it's an 8-bar solo setup or a really good riff and crunchy rhythm setup, but all my vintage stuff wasn't really helping me out live, which led me to the DS1 plugged into a vintage super lead, But even that had its problems because it's just a little solid state, op amp. So fast forward, and I meet Santiago Alvarez, head engineer for Marshall, and for the first time, he really understood what it was that I needed. And I needed an amp that would keep its tone together, whether it was me playing on my last string open or I was bending my first string higher than I should. Yeah. That tone has to be there. It's almost like a vocalist with a beautiful voice that no matter where he or she is singing, the tone quality is there. And that's what I needed. And I said, I know that's not what people do with guitar, electric guitar, but that's my requirement. And so the JVM really got me to that place. So even just making the last record, Shapeshifting, we had so many instances in the studio where you would think, a cranked vintage Fender Deluxe or a 1971 50 watt was going to be the thing. And you put it into the track and you go like, ow, like we can't listen to that playing a melody and then a solo that has a compositional message to it. We need something bigger, rounder. It's got to be able to be pure and sound organic, but it really has to be able to stay together in all the registers. And it was always a JVM that we would go back to. It was the thing that I could say to the engineers, this thing works on stage every night. I can play 3 decades of instrumentals and it's always there, ripping for the solos, beautiful for the melodies, great for the riffs, responds to the guitar's volume control, to the finger touch. So it was a natural that be part of this collection, that you'd have, it was required. It had to be nailed for me to be happy with this, and because I want to use it.
I know that better than anybody. As far as, so let's talk about taking one of your JVMs and then I guess, for lack of a better word, digitizing it to model it for AmpliTube within your collection. So that process, as you know, it was a tedious one. It is a tedious one because you're trying to not only replicate the actual amplifier, but you want to replicate the artist playing that amplifier, and in your case, you. So obviously everyone says the tones in the hand, the pick in hand, the fingers, whatever it is, the blood, however you want to put it. But at the end of the day, we need to replicate a satisfactory tone of the JVM for you. So if you want to talk about a little bit of your process on testing the real JVM versus what we did on Joe Satriani AmpliTube.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a crazy idea to think that you're going to model an amp. I don't know. I mean, the guys are geniuses that they can even just get close, but this is like so close. The thing I have to keep reminding myself is, I've taken these JVM heads literally around the world, almost most of the continents around the world, and played shows. And every night there's moments where I turn around and I go, is that right? It's like, that doesn't sound like last night, And that's because you can never nail these things down 100% in the real world, let alone cyberspace and then modeling reality. They're unbelievably complex, ever changing. There's tubes in there. You've got a different guitar, your strings are different, you're feeling different, you're in a new venue. I mean, it's always changing. So, I had to take a deep breath when I was approached with this opportunity to get it modeled, because I thought, okay, I know it's a model, and I know that in the real world, it's just hard to get the amp to do the same thing night after night on tour, or even just, let's say, you go back to overdub something on a track you did 8 hours earlier in the studio and the amp sounds different. And right, it's just like that weird mojo that you chase. So, that's the big grain of salt that you consider in all this great endeavor, to model such a complex amp. 4 channels, I'm looking over there because there's one right over here too. 4 channels, 3 modes per channel. It's complex. It's got noise gates. It's got all the things that I need to get through a gig and to make a record with, and it's difficult. On stage, and even in this room, it kind of reflects how I keep going back and forth. I've got an old cabinet with greenbacks in there from '69. I got a new cabinet with new greenbacks in it. They sound totally different. I've got my usual G12 T75s that I use most of the time. But in this little room, which is really just the mix room, I can't really say this is exactly how the amp sounds, because the amp is up pushing maybe 115 decibels when I'm doing a gig. So that's a whole other thing that's happening with the amp. The power amps are working. They're hitting these speakers. Maybe I've got, a cabinet with the 75 watters. Maybe it's next to a cabinet with vintage 30s, whims that I have night after night, and I'll tell my tech, to put the different cabinet up. So taking this all into account, I looked at the model and I thought, okay, what are the basic requirements that I need to play my most popular songs? And that should be the starting point. I'm not going to nitpick about how it was different in Mumbai and then in New York City when I used the 25 watters or the vintage 30s over the 75 watters. So I thought, I know that the team is going to have a lot of great cabinets modeled, so they've got that together. As long as I have those two basically together, with the vintage greenbacks and with the T75s, then we're covered. I know we're always covered with that. Even in the studio, that works that way. So my requirement was, it's got to have all the gain, of course, because you can't play those beautiful singing melodies without having all the gain on. And I know this is nitpicking, but it's important to understand how I play. I learned early on in doing gigs when I was young that you could make something sound skinnier with your guitar's volume control, but you couldn't make something fatter. That, if you turned everything on 10 and that was it, then it was the amplifier's job to make it, and that's to make that sound really fat, and that's the only place and the last place it was going to happen, right? Now, so you might as well set your amp to be as fat and woolly as possible, because you can always, use a high-pass filter in your volume control to close it down, to starve the input, to make it sound thinner and chimier, or to turn it all the way up, to not engage the high-pass filter to keep it kind of fat if you want it dark. So, and then the way I pick, of course, is also I use it to make things skinnier. So this is an important fact, because some people may, if they pull up, let's say, a model of a super lead, like the typical Hendrix modeling of a super lead, they just may hear all this high end kind of stuff. And that's difficult for me to deal with as a player of melodies. If it starts so bright like that, like I have no control, I don't want to start using my tone control, because that's a subtraction that I really don't like. But if I start with something that's really big, and then I kind of get to starve the front of the amp, a whole different thing starts to happen. So this is a very strange way of explaining how I wanted that initial hit to be when I plugged right in to the model of the JVM, and I turned that gain all the way up to 10, which is where I set it for my gig on the overdrive channel using the red mode. I wanted to get that feeling like I could do a gig like this. I could just turn this thing on and I could do a gig. So I put up my backing tracks. I'm pointing to my speakers right here at the studio desk. I put up my backing tracks and I said, okay, here I go. This is me, not plugged into the half stack over there for rehearsing, for something. I'm just going to use the AmpliTube collection here and see if I can do the gig. And it felt great. I was getting everything I needed from it. Interesting, when you have music coming from a digital space and then your guitar sound is coming from that same space, it's a cool thing. Yeah.